Let's say China. China. I love them. China. You take China. People say, oh, you don't like China. I like China. China. I love China. 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 I have to have my China. China. When was the last time you heard China? You know, China. I've been saying China all the time. People from China, they love me. Right. China. They say I don't like China. I love China. People think I don't like China. I love China. China. You go over to China.
To start off this scenario, we will go to the earlier stages of the Chinese Civil War. In our timeline, Stalin pressured the Chinese communists into an uneasy alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalists. After Chiang Kai-shek gained more control over China, he then betrayed the communists after using them to help him fight warlords in the Shanghai massacre. When they were betrayed, the communist movement almost completely died, but the communists were able to break away from the nationalists to form their own rural bases, and then from there, the communist movement, to even stand a chance, had no choice but to make a last-ditch, desperate attempt to move to the countryside. This event was known as the Long March, where all that was left of the CCP after the massacre had to march up north to a new headquarters in Yinnan, Shanghai, so that way the CCP could fully reunify its resistance and later reunite China after World War I. At the beginning of this march, there were 100,000 CCP troops, and then by the end of it, only 8,000 survived the march. And afterwards, the only reason why they were able to reunify China later on is because they got lucky when Japan invaded China, causing all the warlords to focus their attention on them. In this alternate timeline, before the Shanghai massacre happens, Stalin would be the one to betray the nationalists, which would cause the communists to fully break away from the nationalists and the First United Front as a whole. From there, Stalin would fully back the communists, who would make gains much earlier against the nationalists, solidifying their power in the east. Then, in 1931, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, the more powerful communists could sign a truce with the nationalists, so that way they could focus on fighting against the Japanese. By making this simple change of having Stalin end the alliance, the 92% of CCP troops that died during the march would live to actually make gains for the communist movement. And on top of that, during the Shanghai massacre, hundreds of thousands to potentially even over 1 million Chinese communists lost their lives. So yeah, this one simple change will save the Soviets and the CCP a lot of time in spreading the revolution to China. From this point, the CCP could move down south instead, where there were more communist sympathizers who could then join the revolution and begin to launch the revolution early. The Japanese would still invade Manchuria in 1931, in this timeline as well. However, by this point, the CCP would most likely control all of these territories, while the nationalists would control much less territories compared to our timeline. By 1936 in our timeline, the nationalists lost a lot of their inner Chinese territories to the other local warlords, and in this timeline, with the CCP having a stronger establishment down south, they would manage to completely conquer the rest of the nationalists, which would end up being fully partitioned by all the warlords. During Japan's invasions, they wouldn't be nearly as successful against the communists as they were against the nationalists in our timeline. This is because the nationalists had some interesting tactics that they used against the Japanese, like abandoning their capital, Nanking, or doing nothing from stopping the Japanese from, doing the stuff that the Japanese did during that time, or flooding one of their most populated regions that led to the deaths of between 400,000 to 500,000 of their own people purposefully in an attempt to stop the Japanese from invading them. So as you can see, the nationalists were not the best at warfare, or competent. Like, what were they thinking when they were actually pulling all those stunts off? The communists would obviously not do any of that stuff, as they at least somewhat knew what they were doing. So when they would go to face Japan during World War II, they would perform significantly better than the nationalists did in our timeline against them. And then eventually, America would, After World War II is over, the CCP would gain control over these northern territories, along with Taiwan from Japan, along with the Japanese island chain north of it. they would also be in a stronger position with way more land under its control and no unified nationalists that they would need to fight against by this point. Within a year after World War II ends, the communists are able to pick off the rest of the warlord Chinese countries, fully restoring China, except for Xinjiang and Manchuria, which will eventually be given to them by the Soviets, but they would still control Mongolia to use as a buffer state in case if China ever becomes hostile towards them, which they did in our timeline. Moving on from the Chinese Civil War, and we now have a China that is unified 4 years earlier in our timeline, with Taiwan included, and it would be in a much better position than it was in our timeline. Moving on to the British Raj, and in 1947 in our timeline, India and Pakistan gained their independence. We will have Britain keep India and Pakistan together as one country in this timeline. That way they would end up being completely neutral. The reason why I'm making this change is so that 1. The Chinese will be less likely to invade a more powerful India to take control of Kashmir, which I would just completely avoid in this scenario, because in our timeline, China invaded the region, killed a bunch of Indians, and then just withdrew from the region for reasons we still don't understand to this day, which has caused India, who is a neutral nation, to become hostile towards China to an extent to this day. By not doing this invasion, 1. China wouldn't waste any resources, and 2. India would be completely neutral towards China, and they could diplomatically solve the Kashmir dispute with them, since it wouldn't be nearly as big as a deal as in our timeline, because it wouldn't be disputed between 3 nuclear powers. It would only be disputed between 2 countries, one of which would be nuclear, because India most likely wouldn't develop nuclear weapons in this timeline, because they only did it in response to Pakistan in our timeline. The third reason why I'd be making this change is because India, without needing to compete with Pakistan, would be able to develop much quicker in this timeline, which would give China a powerful neutral trading partner to trade with, instead of competing against them like in our timeline. The fourth and last reason why I've made this change is because the Soviet-Afghanistan War. In our timeline, the reason why the Afghans were able to put up a heavy resistance against the Soviets, and later the Americans, was because of Pakistan, allowing the rest to support rebels through them. With a neutral India controlling Pakistan, the Indians wouldn't let the rest support the rebels through them. With the neutral India controlling Pakistan, the Indians wouldn't let the rest support the rebels through them so that they could maintain their neutrality, which would allow the Soviets to eventually fully establish control of Afghanistan without much resistance in the 70s, and then after they collapse, China could eventually gain control over them as well. But now, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Moving back in time, again to the early 50s, and politically rise, Mao would not end up being the supreme leader in this timeline. This is because Mao was able to rise to power during the Long March, becoming the face of the movement. But since the Long March is prevented in this timeline, Mao will never become popular and will just remain another member of the CCP, which means all of the mistakes he caused, like the Great Leap Forward disaster, which caused a massive famine to happen along with an economical collapse because he set way too unrealistic targets and poor planning for new industrial and agricultural projects, along with the Cultural Revolution, which purged a bunch of people and got rid of the old Chinese culture. Since Mao would not be the leader in this alternate timeline, those mistakes that caused the deaths of millions more Chinese people will be butterflied away. But the question is, who will take over China? Who will become in charge of China is far from guaranteed. However, there is one man who is perfect for the job, which is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was actually the 3rd supreme leader of China and came into power shortly after Mao's death, and took the mess that Mao left behind in China and reformed everything. He was the one who reformed Chinese communism into the Chinese version of socialism that opened up China to the rest of the world and allowed it to fully industrialize and prosper into the country that it is today. If he were to be the first one to come to power, not only would Mao's reign and the millions of deaths he caused would be prevented, but all the reforms Deng made during his reign would be implemented from the start, and his reign would last from the 40s all the way to the 90s when he retired in our timeline, and then died shortly after. Deng Xiaoping gaining power this early would be far from guaranteed. However, in a better civil war for the communists, it would give him an alternate environment that he could use to rise through the ranks, and could align with an alternate Chinese revolutionary icon until they died, and he takes their place to finish the revolution. If that sounds vague, it is because I don't exactly have much to work with here. The Chinese Civil War would be completely different in this timeline after all. The point is, Deng Xiaoping gains power right from the start and is able to implement his ideas for China immediately after its formation, which will allow China to rise in power and prominence decades earlier than in our timeline, while all the chaos that Mao caused would be prevented. While Deng Xiaoping would be starting to implement his ideas and open up China to the rest of the world, the Korean War would begin in 1950 like it did in our timeline. We will need North Korea to win that, so that way the rest won't have any foothold in Asia. In our timeline, the North Koreans almost won the Korean War because after South Korea gained independence, they didn't exactly have the most competent army. That didn't play well for the South Koreans against the Soviet-backed North Korea, who managed to almost conquer the entire peninsula in a matter of weeks, with half of South Korean forces either dying, getting captured, or going missing. The only reason why South Korea exists today is because the Americans, the UN, helped the South Koreans out and pushed them all the way to China almost. And the reason why North Koreans still exist is because China then came in guns and blazing, so that way they wouldn't have a border with the rest. 3 years of war and 20% of the Korean population later, and both sides signed an armistice, and the two Koreas are still going at it to this day. In our timeline, the reason why America responded as quickly as they were able to was because of the US Secretary Atkinson, who single-handedly drafted up a plan to support the South Koreans to prevent the spread of communism, and with support from Truman, the Americans were able to support the South Koreans within 72 hours of the conflict, starting without even consulting, anyone. All we have to do in this alternate timeline is simply remove the secretary from the equation, and the Americans don't have to get involved as quickly as they do. Maybe he dies early, or doesn't get his position as US Secretary. As long as he's out of the equation, the Americans don't respond as quickly as they do. Even just delaying US involvement by a few days will allow North Koreans to fully conquer the rest of the Korean peninsula, with the rest of the South Koreans fleeing to Japan. In this timeline, instead of the Korean War lasting for 3 years, it lasts for not even a month, and the 3 million Koreans that lost their lives in our timeline would be prevented. There would still be guerrilla warfare, but the Koreans would be able to put those down eventually, and we will be left with a fully united communist Korea. This version of Korea would not be like the dystopian North Korea we have today. During the Korean War, the North Koreans were just a regular communist dictatorship, but then after the war, it kind of broke them in a way, and they had to build up a new country from the ashes of a war that was fought for nothing. A bunker mentality was adopted, and Kim Il-sung rose to power and was seen as the savior of North Koreans from the rest. And then from there, North Korea transitioned into the horrific regime that we know it to be today. In this alternate timeline, since the war would only last a month and would be a quick blitzkrieg, the North Koreans wouldn't have been traumatized by the war, and it would never become what it became in our timeline. It would just be seen as another satellite state of the Soviet Union, and then after the Soviet Union collapses, it will become China's satellite state, which basically happened to North Korea in our timeline. After Korea's reunification, they have two main paths that they can go down. One, they economically stagnate like North Korea did in our timeline. Or two, the student protests that happened in South Korea in our timeline that led to them becoming a democracy could also break out in this timeline, which would cause some reforms to happen, which would likely see the Koreans go down a similar economic path to China in our timeline, where after Mao died, Maoism was reformed into the system that allowed China to become successful as it is now. Korea could end up adopting a similar system that China would end up adopting, which would allow it to eventually economically boom, which could make them become even more wealthy than South Korea is now by having control over the agricultural South Korea and the industrial North Korea under one unified country, with a much larger population that wouldn't have to completely rebuild after a 3-year devastating war. During the 50s, China could start to build up its navy early, since they wouldn't have to focus as much on their land army, and could start to militarize and start to gain influence over the South China Sea. Also during this time, in America, Truman's reputation would be in the gutter, as he would be seen as the man who lost influence in China and Korea, and the domino theory would become much more common during this time. Truman will use the domino theory as an excuse to fully intervene in Indochina on the side of France to ensure that communism doesn't spread to Indochina like it did in our timeline, and so that he could restore some of his reputation as well. With this development, China would militarily intervene in the conflict with funding from the Soviets, which would then back the Viet Minh and Laos and Cambodian rebels, as well as against the Americans and the French. This conflict would become a brutal, long-term guerrilla warfare conflict like what happened in our timeline, but instead, the Vietnam War would start a decade earlier and would last less long, and also, the Vietnam War wouldn't be the Vietnam War. It would be the Indochina War because Laos and Cambodia would be directly involved within the conflict and wouldn't play the secondary role that they did in our timeline. Thailand would also get involved to an extent on the American side against China by allowing American troops to go onto their land, to go into Laos and Cambodia to fight guerrilla wars there. When the Indochina War begins, Thailand would get turned into a fortress by the Americans, and they would use it as the logistics capital of the war and staging ground against Laos and Cambodia, and they would push into south of Indochina while China pushes into the north, and then about 4 years later the war will stalemate between the Americans and the Chinese, with both sides launching missiles at each other's territories while also fighting in guerrilla warfare behind each other's enemy lines. Eventually, both sides would be tired of fighting each other and would sign a peace treaty. China would gain the Chinese alliance sphere in North Vietnam and North Laos, while the Americans would gain the American alliance sphere in South Vietnam, South Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And a DMZ would be established that would go between North and South Vietnam and North and South Laos. From here, you may think that China would then start to spread communism to the rest of the South Pacific until it is united under a Chinese sphere, elevating China to the third superpower on the world stage during the Cold War. But unfortunately, for this scenario, that is not possible. Trust me, I tried. I spent an hour on ChatGPT simulating a million different scenarios on how to make this happen.
Wait, Alter Ego, did you just admit to use ChatGPT to write your scripts? You're a fraud and a
Screw
clickbait.
you, Jimmy. Timmy. Yes, I use ChatGPT, but only purely for testing out different types of scenarios I have in my head, to make them as realistic as possible, and to avoid scenarios like this, where they're just a bunch of outliers that I wasn't aware of. I still write my own scripts, and I actually think of the scenarios on my own. I simply just test those scenarios using AI, and then revise them when needed, like now. Anyways, the reason why this scenario isn't possible to achieve is for the same reason the scenario never happened in our timeline. Communism simply wasn't that popular in the South Pacific. The most popular communist movement in the South Pacific was in Indonesia. At the height of its movement in 1964, they only had support of about 3.8% of their working age population. On top of the movement just not being popular, America had a ton of influence over all of these countries, and although China would be investing into its navy early, it would be nowhere near like its navy today, so they wouldn't be able to even refund these small communist revolutions anyways. The one thing though that we will have to get rid of to an extent is America's influence in the South Pacific. Although China would have access to Taiwan in this timeline, America still had control over the rest of the island chains, and they wouldn't be able to completely cut them off from the rest of the Pacific Ocean in this timeline, but China would still be surrounded. The one way I believe that the Americans can lose most of its influence in the South Pacific is through the association of Southeast Asian nations, aka ASEAN. ASEAN is like the South Pacific's version of the EU in a way, but is way less integrated compared to the EU. In this alternate timeline, we will simply have ASEAN integrate more and earlier. We could first have the bloc create a military alliance structure within the organization similar to what the EU has within its organization and NATO. With this structure, they will then help each other advance their militaries over time while also standardizing different weapons across the alliance like what NATO has, while they also do joint military exercises. Once the Cold War starts to intensify over time, they could then officially declare neutrality from the Cold War, officially creating a third bloc that simply focuses on itself. China could invest into the bloc, and then over time, their economies will grow much faster than they did in our timeline, until they eventually become even more powerful trading partners with China than in our timeline, which will bring even more wealth to China and the South Pacific earlier on. Most importantly though, with the joint military structure and wanting to improve relations with China, they will force the Americans to slowly withdraw from the South Pacific over time, and without the whole Taiwan situation, relations between China and the South Pacific wouldn't be somewhat tense as they are in our timeline. Throughout the Cold War, ASEAN could continue to integrate by creating its own currency, allowing free border movement, and more EU-like initiatives, but without any of the corruption that the EU is drowning in lately, or any of the factors like vetoes that hinder integration. Once they fully establish themselves as their own neutral bloc, they could work with China and the Americans to allow Vietnam and Laos to fully reunify and join the neutral ASEAN bloc, along with Cambodia. With them joining ASEAN and the trust that they would develop between ASEAN and China over time, they would be able to trust them with Indochina, as there would be no reason why they would threaten their southern border. They could also make a deal with each other and China to make the South Chinese Sea a joint ASEAN and Chinese-controlled sea, where everyone has access to the sea to do whatever they want, and they have a board that works with all the different countries to extract the resources and fairly share the profits they make from the area with each other, while also allowing China to freely move ships there without any harassment, as well as the ASEAN members being allowed to do the same, which they would already be doing with each other already because of their free border movement initiative. Without China needing to do the aggressive policies that they do in our timeline in the South China Sea and with Taiwan, along with working with them to reunify Vietnam and Laos, all the South Pacific countries wouldn't have any reason to distrust China, and both China and the Americans would have a new trading market that they could both mutually benefit from, cooperating and trading with. And China would be completely circled by the Americans' military in this timeline as well. By this point, Timmy, you're probably wondering, if this is really a perfect China scenario, then how come China hasn't gained any land this deep into the scenario other than a few islands, or expand their influence gaining a bunch of satellite states throughout the Cold War? And to that I say, you're dumb, Timmy. You're dumb. The thing about China as a country is their geopolitical strategy is actually superior to the Americans and the Soviets. The Soviets have gained geopolitical influence through pure force, through the occupation and puppeting of Eastern Europe after World War II, while also sponsoring communist coups like in Cuba, while the Americans currently try to gain geopolitical influence over other countries by going in random countries trying to start a democracy for the people who don't have any basic values needed to actually have a democracy, like the West does, nor the support to do so. Well, up until Trump came into power, slowly weakening the West over time to become completely dependent on the Americans so that they would do whatever they want them to do. China, on the other hand, walks into those same countries and makes economic deals with them, and both parties mutually benefit from them, which allows them to, over time, gain positive influence over those countries, which we're seeing in our timeline in developing countries. While the Americans and the Soviets completely control their spheres of influence through fear and force, while expanding their influence through fear and force, China just makes a bunch of deals that benefit both parties. All I've done in this scenario is give China better opportunities to make those deals by developing better circumstances to have mutually beneficial relationships with India and the South Pacific, while not being encircled by those same countries like they are in our timeline, and also because the aggressive expansionism that you've all been waiting for is about to happen with the fall of the Soviet Union. In our timeline, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it left a giant power vacuum in Europe, which was filled mostly by the Americans, and in Asia, which was filled by Russia, until in recent years it switched more over to China. In this timeline, China would be in a position where it would be more than ready to exert its influence. In Central Asia, when all the newly independent countries are getting on their feet, they could infiltrate those countries' governments to gain control over them, as well as gaining control over Korea like they did with North Korea in our timeline to an extent, as well as Afghanistan and Mongolia, while the Americans are focusing on stabilizing Europe. They would also gain influence over Siberia more quickly in our timeline through making deals over the oil resources and rare earths in that region with the newly independent Russia to help them out economically, as during the 90s the Russians were really struggling because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. By gaining control over all these new countries, these countries will allow the Chinese to mass migrate into all of these countries, which the Chinese would be able to do even easier than in our timeline because of all the changes that we made in this scenario that make China's population much larger to this point, while also not having the one-child policy instated as well. That is leading China to a demographic collapse right now in our timeline. China and the new puppet governments will frame this as Chinese workers moving in to help them out economically, which would be true to an extent because China would be investing into these countries for mutual economic gains, like building pipelines and mining resources and stuff. But they would also allow regular Chinese citizens to easily move to these countries by allowing this to happen slowly but surely. By allowing this to happen, these countries would become dominated by the Chinese government over time until they become minorities in their own countries like Canada. Now we're going to fast forward to June 23rd, 2023 during the Ukraine War, during the Wagner Rebellion. A lot of you guys may remember this event taking place if you kept up with geopolitical news during this time. But long story short, Putin and this one ugly dude got into some beef, and this ugly dude just happened to own his own private military who marched up to Moscow, but chickened out just before he got there. But in this timeline, he's not gonna do that, and Russia will just go into an all-out civil war. I already covered this alternate history scenario before, so just click on that after you're done watching the rest of the video for more context if you want to. But basically, what happens is China has an excuse to invade Siberia to prevent any warlords from gaining control over nukes that are in that area, which will also result in them puppeting Siberia, which they will use to extract gas and natural resources from the region. And then they will do the exact same thing that they have done in this scenario so far and allow Chinese immigrants to completely outpopulate the Siberians, which they're already starting to do in our timeline. Over time, the more sparsely populated countries in China's sphere will be outpopulated and annexed into China, while the more populated areas will also eventually join as more autonomous zones with significant Chinese populations in them. As I mentioned in my What If Russia Had a Civil War in 2023 video, Trump may succeed in fear-mongering Canada and Greenland to join America, especially in this scenario after the Chinese annex all of the new territories, which would happen well after the Trump presidency, but they would still control a large portion of Asia. Whether or not that happens, it doesn't matter because I control the scenario, and I think this would look much better in the thumbnail. And screw Canada. With China officially spreading its influence and culture, they officially gained their place as a global superpower that would now be even bigger and stronger and even more of a threat against America's global hegemony with their superior foreign policy. The Second Cold War would be more of an economical Cold War as opposed to the more military Cold War during the second half of the 20th century, despite its violent start with the Russian Civil War. Over time, countries will become more and more neutral as they gain economic benefits from both America and China, to the point where we will start to see different blocs start to form over time of different regions that are economically really close with each other, while also benefiting from trade with China and America. If China to keep America in check, they would stop doing what they have been doing since the collapse of the Soviets and completely switch their foreign policy over time from the violent spreading of its ideology to China's soft power strategy, leading the way to a much more peaceful 21st century, and that is the perfect note to end the scenario on. Hey everyone, post-editing Alter Arc here. I was watching a bunch of Alternate History Hub's videos, and I was thinking that he calls all of his viewers Jimmy. I was thinking I could call you guys all Sparkies, cause, Alter Arc, Sparky, and also people call electricians Sparkies. And a few months ago, I was doing electrical work full time, so I thought it'd be kind of cool. People also call electricians Sparkies because they think that electricians are gay, so now that I think about it, I'd be calling you guys all gay also. I like the name. I'm calling you guys all Sparkies. Anyways, that's it for the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, turn on notifications, and binge all of my videos. I've got a pretty decent catalog of videos that will keep you guys entertained for a little bit if you want to, and it also really helps out the channel, promoting my channel and the algorithm. So yeah, please do that if you have the time. Don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot, and I'll see you all in the next video.